Well, hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for tuning in to another of our virtual events. And it is a real treat and an honor to have one good friend of mine and one new friend, J Todd Scott, longtime friend, author of numerous books, including this killer new book called The Flock, which we'll be talking about. A little bit of a departure, but still within your wheelhouse in a lot of ways. Really look forward to getting into this. And Phillip Fracassi, who has written this absolutely killer new book, A Child Alone with Strangers, which, man, there's really something for everybody in this book. And we'll get into that. It's a fantastic mashup of different styles. Also, before we get started, what a beautiful design.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
Yeah. Really
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah, they did it. I think Claire Nogle, I think, is the design. I'm going by memory. I think it says in the back flap jacket, but yeah, so she designed it, and I thought they did a really nice job. Especially, I love the red spine, which was a surprise to me when I saw that. So I didn't see that until I saw the book. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
And Phillip has sent us some cool, very cool book plates with the same design, which I've tucked in. So I'm flying solo here tonight, folks, but as always, if you have questions for Todd or Phillip, go ahead and put them in the comments field, and I'll be happy to keep my eye on those as we go along. And if you'd like to order a copy, I will also put the link. I may have to do it after the program's over, but you know how to get in touch with us if you'd like copies of either book. The holidays are coming. Buy
That's
one,
right.
buy two. Yeah.
And these are heartwarming Christmas gifts.
These are, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing says holiday cheer like those two books right there.
Exactly.
About a boy and his panda, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, let's just first let's kind of dive in. And I first met Todd when this book came out, The Far Empty, and here's one of the original copies, which had this awesome cover design.
Right.
And,
that's up on the wall. You can't see. It's on my side over here. So
right. And so you published, I think, 4 novels, right, in that particular series.
Published 3 in that series, and then Lost River was standalone. So it was
okay.
Far Empty, Far Empty, High White Sun, This Side of Night's kind of the border trilogy. Lost River is a standalone crime novel, but still kind of in the same vein. Just moved from Texas to Kentucky, which is where I am now, and now The Flock. So
right. So in the Lost River, I know that came out, right in the beginning or in the middle of the COVID pandemic, first year. Difficult time to have a book released. And I know that that particular book was one that was very personal to you and near and dear to your heart. So before we move on to The Flock, would you mind just saying a few words about that book?
Yeah. Lost River is, unfortunately, and I think probably, Phil can talk to this a little bit too. It was tough writing during the COVID, heart of the COVID years, the teeth of the COVID time. It was tough publishing. And so Lost River was a book I'd long wanted to write about my home, Kentucky, again, which is where I am now. I had done drug work out here in Kentucky at about the middle part of my career, had seen the earlier start of the opioid crisis, which is now plaguing all of the U.S. So I really wanted to kind of write about that kind of from a unique viewpoint and from a very personal viewpoint from stuff I had seen and other stuff I'd been involved in. And so Lost River was the book that came out of that desire. And unfortunately, it's one of those books that you feel never really got the attention that you would have hoped that it did, or didn't kind of get some of the focus, because I thought it had a lot to say about the current crisis and some kind of unique things to say. And I'm terribly proud of the book. Hope it finds life in other venues and other ways. But it was a tough time to try to get out and push books during COVID, understandably so.
Well, it's interesting because, around the store, you've always been one of our favorites. And periodically we'd say, I wonder what Todd's up to. I haven't seen a new book announced yet. And then all of a sudden the book was released and I wasn't even aware of it until somebody pointed out this new book, The Flock.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the kind of the background for this book. Was there a particular incident in your own work as a DEA agent that sort of inspired this, or where did this book come from?
The Flock was, as you said earlier, kind of a departure from what I had done before. But I had long had an interest in kind of, I don't know, horror. But I mean, I think The Flock kind of touches some horror elements. People who've heard me talk before know that I actually got agented on a book that was much more in the wheelhouse of a Stephen King book or a Dean Koontz book, much more like what Phillip is doing. But that book didn't sell. And as a result of that book not selling, I wrote The Far Empty. And of course, obviously, we're all excited with how that turned out. But I still had a kind of an interest in that kind of genre, the kind of horrorish, thrillerish genre. And I'd long wanted to write a book about a cult. And it just so happened that, you had COVID going on. This book was written, during that time. You're kind of locked up, cloistered at home. It's easy to think about conspiracies and all sorts of things, and maybe the end of the world. So that all kind of came together in an idea I had been kind of nurturing for a while. And again, the end result was The Flock. So,
Right now, Phillip, tell us a little bit about the inspiration. We'll just kind of go back and forth if that's cool with you guys, and let you talk to each other, of course. But you've written a number of shorter pieces, novellas, and so forth, yet making the way to this much larger canvas, the sort of epic, as I said, canvas that kind of combines a lot of different elements of storytelling. I see a lot of classic noir riffs in here, along with some old school, the Dust Jacket mentioned Robert McCammon, and I was thinking about some of those books that I read a long time ago, Boy's Life and Going South and all those books. Talk about Child Alone with Strangers, the basic idea and how you came to write it.
Yeah, well, I first want to say to Todd that I discovered Todd through Lost River, and then I went back and bought the Border books. So don't feel like nobody saw the book, because I saw the book.
Oh, great, thank you.
and then I went back and bought all your books in like nice hardcover edition. So I have them all downstairs. A Child Alone with Strangers. Yeah, so I was kind of cutting my teeth on short fiction. I haven't been doing this very long. I've only been writing genre fiction since about 2015, and I got agented kind of out of the gate. And the after I only had a story collection come out, maybe a few other stories, and he said, "Look, you can keep writing short stories and express yourself in that format, or you can write novels and have a career." And so I was like, all right, well, I will write a novel. And I now have that was my agent number one. I'm not now an agent number three, but yeah. So when I was thinking about what that first novel would be, and I'd written 3 novels prior that were not genre novels. Kind of the opposite, I guess, a little bit of what Todd was saying is I was writing more like literary kind of dark fiction, but not supernatural or horror, and they didn't really go anywhere. But so I was thinking about what I wanted my first genre novel to be, and I was kind of thinking that I wanted it to be sort of a kitchen sink book. I wanted to have all the cool stuff that I grew up with, reading Koontz and King and Barker and McCammon, and it's like I want to have I want to have a telepathic kid. I want to have a creature in the woods. I want to have an old scary house, and I kind of wanted it to be a big, fun, sprawling epic, like the kind of book you lose yourself in and you're staying up late to read, when you're a 14-year-old kid or whatever. And so I knew I wanted it to be a big book. I knew I knew it was a big story. I knew there was a lot of characters and, to track and to explore. And so that was kind of how it started. And I think I added so it's sort of, as you mentioned, it's a mashup. It's a bit of a police procedural in a way, where you follow the kidnapping and what the FBI is doing and the police are doing to find the child who's been abducted. And then it's half kind of a straight up horror novel. And it kind of goes back and forth a little bit until the last act where it all kind of comes together. So Yeah, it just kind of grew organically. So when I think I started with the idea of the boy being kidnapped. I think I liked the idea of him having telepathic powers and screwing with the kidnappers. And then I think when I had the idea of um, a monster creature, kind of this unknown variable in the woods outside this house where they were keeping him, it all kind of came together like for me. So from that point on, it was really just a matter of just getting it down as fast as I could. And I've written I think 3 or 4 novels since that one. Um,
Really?
yeah, so I've got Child came out, and then I have in February I have a book called Gothic
Mm.
that's coming out from
Yeah, you sent
Cemetery
me the
Dance. Yeah,
advanced
exactly.
copy. Yeah.
Yep. And Earthling just put out this really pretty limited edition, but this is like long gone. They only made 250 and they sold out in like 20 minutes, unfortunately. But the Cemetery Dance will be trade. And then in July, I have a book called Boys in the Valley, which is coming out from Tor Nightfire in the United States and Orbit in the UK Commonwealth countries. So I have another book called Brothers, which I'm writing right now for June 2024 release from that same tandem of publishers, Orbit and Tor. So yeah, so lots going on, and they have a couple books that are being shopped.
Wow,
That I'm hoping to
fantastic.
sell. Yeah, one's a sci-fi novel called Observe, and one's a thriller, kind of a straight thriller with a little bit of a lot of supernatural, a little bit of horror, called Blue Butterfly. So we're trying to sell those right now. And then I'm also kind of writing stories, and I'm writing a screenplay and other stuff like that. But yeah, very happy with the reception so far with Child Alone with Strangers. People seem to like it. Reviews have been good, so hopefully it keeps getting out there and people keep discovering it. That's all you can really, to Todd's point, it's all you can really hope for as an author. You can only control so much, and the rest you just kind of hope word of mouth spreads and people like it and they keep talking about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we talked about setting something up coming up in maybe in the summer in June or July here at the Poison Pen, which would be great. And we'll definitely do that.
Yeah, I love that.
One of the things I wanted to ask you was that, like some of these epic, definitely Stephen King and some of the people, Straub and people you've suggested, there are a lot of deep themes going on in your book. It's there are all these different elements, but there's some heavy themes of pain and loss, compassion and empathy and things like that, all going on with this 9-year-old kid.
Yeah.
Was that just something that those themes just kind of came out of his own pain, his own experience?
Well, I think, when I do supernatural, I do it for a reason. When I do horror, I do it for a reason. It's to serve the story and to serve the characters. I try not to have it something that's outside of the story. And if that makes sense, I want it to feel very integrated. I want it to feel very real, I guess would be the best way to put it. Very grounded. So like that, like you're describing the character. So the point being is the characters are very important to me. And I want the characters to be very real. I want them to have very real feelings that readers would connect with easily, real emotions. I was speaking to someone about this book on a podcast, and they were saying how complex the villains were, and how they they were like reading, and they're like, I wasn't really sure how to feel about anybody, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, because the villains all had these backstories that kind of humanized them, and Henry, the 9-year-old boy, is so complex, and he has, he goes through a lot of different things, and so I think and he does some things that are maybe questionable too. So it's, I try and make all my characters and all my stories and books very real. It's very important to me that they're very grounded in reality, and that all the horror and supernatural stuff serves the characters versus the characters serving the supernatural and the horror. So I guess I always am thinking about writing my characters in that way. I guess to your point, thematically, just making sure that they're very real and that they have real emotions, and that readers can empathize with them. Because I think once the readers empathize with your characters, then it makes the horror that much more horrible, and it makes when the danger enters, I think the readers are more interested and they really want to know what happens next.
Right.
So I always try and spend a lot of time building up my characters, whether they're villains or heroes or protagonists or antagonists or whatever the case is.
And that's why I think that the Stephen King, comparisons are valid and good, right? I mean, because the best Stephen King novels are really grounded in these fantastic characters, and so, if you think about The Stand and you think about Dead Zone and you think about Carrie, I mean, even the villains are three-dimensional and have this texture and reality to them. And they're horror novels, but to me, always only in the loosest sense of the term. I mean, The Dead Zone's a horror novel because horrible things happen, but, there's not really ghosts or demons or vampires or things like that. And I think A Child Alone treads a lot closer to that territory. You've got this broad cast, broad net of really, really interesting characters, in this really, really unusual, difficult situation, and kind of how they interact and bounce off of each other, how they react to the horrible situations around them is what the horror of it is. But at heart, it's about really interesting, sometimes empathetic, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes really, really unlikable characters doing things. And that's why it's interesting, Patrick, because I think both books are kind of similar. They both involve a child who's been kidnapped, a child who may have unique abilities. They both involve kind of police procedurals. So people who would otherwise maybe say, well, I don't really want to, touch a horror book. I mean, these are horror adjacent, right? I mean, they have horrible things, but there's definitely mystery and thriller aspects and these kind of police procedural aspects. So the books are kind of two sides of the same coin in many respects, or at least kind of, walking on the same path of what they're trying to do.
Right. Well, it's they touch upon, universal fears, and primal fears that we all have in some ways. And I was interested in thinking about, one of the Dust Jacket copy mentioned Laird Barron, who I really like a lot, and who's been here to the store several times. Great writer, great guy. And and also John Connolly a little bit, the Irish writer. They tap into this forest mythology or folklore. And I'm thinking, is that maybe like a Teutonic sort of mythology, and how do the monsters of the forest differ from, the monsters of the desert, say, or different elements? Can you speak to that at all, Philip?
Yeah, the monster is interesting because I really gave it a lot of thought, and I wanted her to be
We shouldn't have spoilers, by the way. So
right. So I'm gonna try and do it in a very non-spoiler way. I think it's okay. I think the creature in the woods is I think it's in like the jacket copy, so I think we're okay. But I wanted her very a kind of a combination of myth and reality. And so her features are based in, we'll say, biology. Okay, not human biology, but earthly biology. But she's also there's also like this alluded to history to her. And interestingly, well, that would be a spoiler, but so we'll just say, but yeah, and I think I'm writing a book right now called Brothers, for example, which ties into this conversation a little bit, because one of the things that I like to do is I don't necessarily like to hold myself hostage to, as a writer, to what has come before me. And my attitude about coming up with creatures or coming up with otherworldly or inhuman entities is that I don't feel like I'm beholden to other writers or other stories. I don't feel like it has to fit into a category. Is it a witch? Is it a zombie? Is it a vampire? Is it, in my mind, I can have, my creatures can be whatever I want them to be. So I like playing with creating original characters and ideas, and kind of tying them into like very old mythology, kind of mixed with like sort of my own kind of made up mythology. And so I think this is an example of that, which is where I really wanted to do something that was completely original and not feel like I had to tie that character into something that was pre-existing. And I'm doing the same thing with Brothers, which is there's another entity where this during the Civil War period, which is not categorizable. And I think, and so and I really like that. I don't see any reason to always try with genre fiction to necessarily be like, this is a werewolf novel, this is a vampire novel, this is. I don't like categories, and I don't like being confined. So when I write, I'd like to just kind of like go straight from, you know, from the ground up and build something new. And I think that's kind of what I tried to do with Mother in this book.
Yeah, I love writers who do that. You know, I mean, there are a couple of that come to mind. One of my favorites is Frederick Brown. I don't know if you know his
Oh yeah,
work.
sure.
You know, you read a Frederick Brown story and you're not sure what the hell's going to happen. You know, it
Yeah.
could seem like a complete like set piece. You know, there are a number of the guy in the lab late at night kind of setups that just go off into this weird, crazy. I love that. You know, I love that element also of classic pulp fiction. You know, of
Mhm.
20s, 30s, 40s, where there's all this interesting, as you say, they were creating genres, you know, purely out of the imagination.
Yeah,
You know,
they weren't thinking about bookstore. This is not a negative thing
Placement.
about bookstores. They weren't thinking about placement. They weren't thinking about marketing. They weren't thinking about that stuff. They were just writing whatever they felt like writing. And you know, Todd and I have spoken about this in the past, where he was like, "I think this next book's going to be it's going to be like a horror novel," and I remember being like very excited about that. And I think I want to talk about the flock a little bit, because what I really like about horror, or what I really like about horror versus like sci-fi or fantasy or even crime or even thriller in a way, is that there are no boundaries. There are no preconceived notions. I mean, there are preconceived notions with readers, but there's no. With sci-fi, you sort of have to play within certain rules. With fantasy, you have to sort of play within certain rules. And I think with horror, it's kind of anything goes. Like, to your point about Frederick Brown, who's amazing, is like you can do anything you want. And I thought that was interesting with The Flock, was because I read Todd's DEA novels, and I remember thinking like, boy, to combine this kind of really intense knowledge of crime and criminal and procedural, police procedural kind of stuff with something supernatural would be so much fun. And The Flock was a great example of that. You know, I spoke after I read it early on, and I just loved that. I loved that mashup of like you know, apocalyptic meets like procedural kidnapping, you know, murder slash, you know, homicide or whatever.
A little bit of Hitchcock thrown in too, man. I mean,
Yeah, it's a mystery too. Exactly. Yeah.
all the wonderful bird kind of symbolism and, you know, that whole architecture that you create in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that as we ease our way into The Flock here?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had the strong bird imagery throughout that thing. And obviously they did a great job. Thomas and Mercer did a great job with the cover, with kind of the birds also mimicking flames. And, you know, I kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit on my cult, right? Like I wanted to create a cult that was believable and had some consistency to it. But I didn't want to like recruit people to a cult. So writing this book, I had to go back and forth about what the mythology, you know, Philip was talking about kind of mythology and stuff like that, what the mythology of this cult was, what the people believed, how much of that I wanted to introduce in the book. Because again, I didn't want it to be a how-to manual on how to create a cult. But I think the main thing that I wanted to do with this book is, you know, cults are mysterious and enigmatic, and they kind of defy explanation in many ways. And so I wanted to structure the book to reflect that. So in a typical book like this, you'd have an A and B narrative, like a present and past. So you have the kidnapping that go on in the present, and then you would go have these alternating chapters where you would have a B story that would take place when the cult was at its most active, and you'd kind of see how the cult has changed over time. That would have been a completely legitimate way of writing this book. But I wanted to do kind of this puzzle mystery enigmatic thing. So my backstory of the cult is done in all these kind of epistolary things. And I very much wanted to write a book in that vein. So the backstory all is, you know, FBI reports and medical examiners reports and birth certificates and newspaper articles and even script pages, you know, because this cult had been famous for a while. And so, and each of those things is kind of presented out of time, out of order. So your view as a reader of the cult is influenced by all these other people's view of it as well. And just like we can't explain necessarily why people are drawn to cults or how they operate, as a reader, it's very difficult for you to kind of get a sense of exactly the reality that this cult was operating in. It's real slippery, right? I mean, who's telling the truth? Who really believes what, what they say they believe, and what really happened 10 years ago, and what's happening now with the main character. So that was the fun of writing this book, not just writing about a cult, but structuring the book the way I did, which I honestly won't do again because it's kind of a pain in the ass to do. But it was enjoyable to do it while I was putting the book together.
And when you set the book, obviously it goes a little bit out into the future, a couple of years, not too far.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about some of the basics of these cults. There's what they have in common, the way you present them in the book. A lot of them have this sort of messianic figure.
Right.
In this particular case, there's like some scam where you pay in, and they very much prey upon the vulnerable.
Right.
And I couldn't help but think, forgive me, people, if there's anybody watching, but Scientology, as part of that racket, and you think about, Waco, of course, and Jonestown. There are certain, what are some of the main beats that you included in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I very consciously drew from real cults and kind of put it all in a blender. And you hit a lot of them, as well as the one that's been in the news a lot lately, that the Vow series is about. That's the Rainier character. That's very much, he was tossed in the mix. I name check a lot of actual cults in there. And I did a lot of research. I didn't have to research all the cop stuff, but I did have to research the cult stuff. And so I wanted this cult to be very much a product of the 21st century. So there's a lot of stuff about the internet and memes, and then you connecting via the internet, and this kind of self-actualization, and all wellness being a little bit, all of that kind of thrown in there, because we see that nowadays. We see that on the internet. We see a lot of that stuff, this idea of kind of conspiracies and conspiracies. I mean, I'm not a topical writer. I didn't pick this book to write at this time because this is what was going on in the world, but it definitely had a kind of unusual synergy where the things I wanted to write about, it wasn't very hard to find real world examples of it, and just to sand off the name, give it a new coat of paint, and toss it in the mix. But I wanted the cult to be modern and to use modern techniques in a way that it approached people. And I think that's reflected in both versions of the cult that we see in the flop.
Can I interject real quick with one question? I was going to say, I thought was a really fascinating decision was to and I don't, this is a spoiler, is the family drama within the cult was like kind of an, it was sort of it kind of like doubled down on all the tension already built into that kind of situation. But on top of, sorry.
The two sisters.
Yeah, the sisters, the sisters and the daughter, right? And just kind of like that relationship. I don't want to spoil anything, but I thought that was really engaging. Their relationship and how it kind of how the cult influenced it over the course of years.
Right, because these cults are such kind of finely tuned environments, right? Like they're these hermetically sealed environments that and they have to be that way, because if reality intrudes, then they don't work, right? Which is why these cults tend to kind of be off on their own and that sort of thing. So there are these kind of own little mini universes, but yet you have all the passions and prejudices and guilt and anger in these little mini communities. Right. But so much of that is out of sight. We don't see a lot of that. So I just tried to imagine what it would be like to have some really, really difficult family dynamics also driving this cult. And again, kind of underlying who really believes what? Does anyone really believe this stuff?
Yeah.
Right. You know, but we
And how the
find,
mythology of the cult was a kind of ever evolving in a way.
yeah, ever evolving,
Yeah.
right? As
Yeah.
other people were brought into it, as people put their own kind of opinions on it. And I
Which
wanted
is
to
how real religion is.
right. And so I wanted readers to do that too, right? As they caught each clue, as they read about each new character, you know, as they saw how people changed over time, then their opinions of the cult would change over time too. But you know, it's a difficult way to write a book. It's polarizing, I think. You know, you're talking about the reception of A Child Alone, which has been universally great. Everyone I've talked to who's read it has loved it. You know, The Flock has been people who like what I did with the epistolary stuff really like it. People who don't really don't, right? And you know that going into it when you structure a book this way, that it may not work for everyone. But I thought the upside was worth it, because I just thought it was a really interesting way to tell a story that's really not new. I mean, you know, it's a story about a cult. There's a lot of cult stories. There have been a lot of cult stories lately, but I thought the engine that I used to drive this car was a little bit different.
Now, do most cults, would it be accurate to say, have that doomsday sort of vibe to them? You know, it's like there is this there's day of reckoning coming, and only the chosen few will survive, kind of thing.
I think most cults ultimately kind of, you know, vanishing point there, right? You know, because in order to kind of continue to hold people close and pull people in, you have to continue to promise something, right? Or you have to continue to instill such a fear in them,
right,
that they stay. So I think even the most, you know, a cult that starts without necessarily talking about the apocalypse always ends there, when all's said and done, because I don't know how else they can end, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
How did you guys kind of become aware of each other in your books? I don't want to get in the way here. If you guys, why don't you talk to each other about your work? And I'll dip in with some questions.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just want to say also on to what you were saying, Todd, is I think also the apocalyptic thing and the doomsday thing is what's also fascinating about which I think is very unique with your book, is that you take the element of like what's real, what isn't real, right? But
Yeah.
then you ground the book in so much reality with the very, like, I think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought they're like court
Court documents.
court documents and the autopsy stuff, which is all very like, because this is what you do, probably good part of your living is dealing with this kind of stuff. But so it's all very real, right? And so it makes the question mark side of the story even more fascinating, because you're kind of like, I mean, it adds a layer of like, well, I feel like I should really believe this because this is all very believable. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of play with the readers,
Right.
what's real, what isn't real, sort of thing.
And that's exactly what I wanted to do. Have that really, really real stuff versus stuff that the reader has to kind of say, well, I don't know, maybe, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting that you decided to use that to create the background for the cult, because a normal thriller, what you'd say is you just story, and then you kind of pick up pieces from what the dialogue would be or what the actors, the characters' interaction would be. So I thought that was an interesting choice. As far as how Todd and I met, I'm just online. I think you mentioned one of my books once, and I was like, "Whoa, you're a fan of my."
Well, it was your book of short stories.
Beneath the Pale Sky, I think, right?
Right, Beneath the Pale Sky, and I had actually read a review of it in Publishers Weekly, and thought, wow, that sounds pretty good. I'm a big Laird Barron fan, and it sounded very much, like his stuff. And I met Laird, and Laird's actually been very supportive of my writing as well. It's interesting. Phillip and I have moved from kind of crime or literary dark fiction into genre fiction, and Laird for a little bit has moved from genre fiction into crime novels, right? So shows we're all kind of working out, out of the same stuff. But in any event, I picked that up and read it and thought it was great. And I always try to call out writers whose stuff I've liked and who I've been impressed with. Because when I put up on Instagram or Twitter, any of my own stuff, people ignore it. It's crickets, right? But if you put up bourbon you're drinking, dog photos, or if you name check other authors, then people like that. And so I think I did that. And then we kind of started corresponding, as you do, back and forth on Twitter. And you mentioned A Child Alone and asked if I'd be interested in taking an early look at it, which I did and thought it was fantastic. And that's just kind of how
Yeah.
it was. But he's a tremendous short story writer, and the Beneath a Pale Sky is a wonderful book to read. But it's tough to make a living. Your agent was definitely right. It's tough to make a living writing short stories. And I'm a shitty short story writer. I've written a couple and in anthologies, and I was always the worst short story writer in the book, because it's just a really, really unique talent to be able to write high quality, engaging short story or novella length pieces. And Phillip can do that. And if you can do that, I think it's a lot easier to expand out to novels. I think it's hard to start as a novelist and work your way back to writing short stories, or at least it's been hard for me.
Interesting. Yeah. It was funny when Todd commented on my book, I immediately replied with a photo of my of my J Todd Scott first edition hardcover collection of every book he's ever put out. So which is a big thrill for me. It's one of the things about Twitter, for all the negatives about it, I've met so many friends and writers and through that, through social media. So I never say anything bad about it. I mean, obviously there's problems with that stuff, but boy, it's such a great way to reach out to people you would never, ever, ever be able to interact with.
Well, and for me, and I can't speak for Phillip, but for me, I don't have a literary community. I mean, I have a full day job that has nothing to do with books. So, other than when I do a book release and can for a couple of weeks pretend to be an author, I don't have any other outlet. So the only time I really can interact with other writers is through social media, and again, it's got a lot of limitations and plenty of issues, but I've met most of the authors I know via that media as opposed to anything else.
Well, in the before times,
Right.
we had some great events here at the store where we did with Willie Lawton and Joy.
I've been very fortunate to come out and host those events there, and those are fantastic. But I'm not in Arizona anymore. But
right.
But that's how Phil and I met, in mutual admiration and both writing, I think, books that we found very, very interesting. And it's always great when another writer that you admire likes what you're doing. And I was surprised that he was really interested in my stuff, because it was quite a bit different than what at the time the short stories I was reading. But then I read the full text of Child Alone, and I was like, oh yeah, I can see why we would really like the same stuff, because the greatest compliment I think you can give another writer is like, man, I wish I had written that book. And I got about midway through A Child Alone, and I turned to my wife and said, damn, I really wish I'd written this book. Because it was great. It touched on all the sort of things that I like, in characterization and dialogue, and it's got kind of propulsive action. And I'm a fan of big books. Big books are tough to write. All my earlier Big Ben series books are big, long books. I like working on that canvas, and A Child Alone is like that. So it touched on everything, and I was like, damn, I really wish I had written this book. So
actually,
wait. I'm sorry, Patrick, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you both that question about the large canvas. And what are some of the challenges of writing, going from the shorter form into the longer form, keeping the intensity going? Can you talk to that a little bit?
It's interesting because I like I said, I've written, I think, 4 books since I wrote Child, and I wrote 3 novels before Child, and none of them are the length of Child Alone with Strangers. So I really served the story. And when it's actually sort of interesting, because when I wrote when I was first writing Child, when I was with agent number 1, uh, he kept trying to make me write something different. He wanted me to write a very short crime novel, and he kept trying to fit child into this different shape. And I was, and normally I'm really not that resistant to that kind of thing. I'm not, I'm not like the painter that gets upset if the lighting is wrong on the canvas, or whatever. But I was kind of like, no, I have a very clear vision of what this book is, and that's not it. And he was like, well, you're hurting yourself by writing a novel this long, because you're a first-time novelist and nobody's going to want to buy a 175,000 word novel, and or 600-page novel in human terms. And I was like, but that's just, it is what it is. And when my current agent, who's been with me for 3 years, when we were actually shopping it, we actually had an offer from a publisher who wanted to publish it, but they would have asked me to cut 50,000 words. And I said no. And this was, that was not an easy decision for me. I'd never been offered a publishing deal, so for a novel. And so but I just knew very clearly in my head what this book was and the story I wanted to tell and the way I had to tell the story. But it's not but I haven't, the other novels Boys in the Valley, Gothic, Observe, Blue Butterfly, those were all in the 80 to 90,000 word count, because that's what the story called for. So to answer your question about the short story versus novel, I approach them completely differently. I approach novels much the same way I would approach a screenplay, which is that I have an insanely detailed structure, an outline that I build, that takes me probably, depending, but on average about 3 to 4 weeks, where I break down every single chapter, notes on every chapter, relationships. What am I seeding? What's the misdirection? What is, and then when that's all done and I feel really good about it, that's only then do I begin writing it. And if the story changes while I'm writing it, which is allowed, if the characters evolve ways I didn't foresee, then I can go back to that outline and I can go, okay, now I need to kind of like readjust it. But it's much easier to adjust that outline than it is to kind of rethink the novel that I'm writing as long form prose. So that's why I work that way. With short stories, I usually know the beginning. I don't even say that. I know the idea, the core idea, and I know the ending. And then I kind of write basically just from that. I don't do any sort of structure work or outlining or anything like that with short work. So it's two very different approaches. And as Todd can speak to, also we've both done screenwriting. Screenwriting is a very technical format. There are a lot of rules. You can't stray too far from those rules. And it's very structured because you are building a foundation for other people to work from. So you can't screw around too much. If you're the writer and director and producer and all that stuff, like Quentin Tarantino, you can kind of be a little bit more loose with it. But so those technical things like that I've learned by teaching myself, like with reading guys like John Truby and Sid Field and Blake Snyder and Robert McKee and all these guys, I apply a lot of that to my screenwriting, and then I have since applied a lot of that into my novel work.
What's interesting about that is, Philip and I couldn't approach novels any more differently, right? Now I do plot and do outlines and stuff for the screenwriting, but for the novels, even for the Flock, even given how this book was structured, I didn't start with an outline. I just sit and go, and none of my novels have I outlined. I just start
really
page one, sentence one, word one, and go. And I don't know that that's the most efficient way to do it. I mean, I have a very good sense of the characters by the time I sit down. I mean, I know the characters. I always know the beginning, generally know the ending and have no idea how I'm going to get between those two. So, the Flock was a high wire act. I mean, I'm creating all of that chronology and all of those individual pieces just every morning when I sit down. Like I've not plotted it out, not thought it out. I know what I want to do. I'm like, yeah, I really think it'd be cool to write some screenplays for a movie that was never filmed for a cult that didn't exist. And I just,
Right.
start writing some screenplay pages.
Yeah.
So I have to do a lot of revising, and I write myself down into some holes at times, but I have never pre-plotted or outlined a book at all. So,
Well, what I've discovered is that my way of doing things is actually not the norm. I think a lot of writers do exactly what you're describing. Is they just Stephen King is a great example of somebody who just writes from the hip. So it's interesting. I think I would just be too terrified to do it that way. I don't think I had the self-confidence to write a book that way. I think is what it comes down to.
The thing is, I didn't have the sense to do it any other way. Like when I started writing late in life,
Yeah.
I just said I didn't really know how writers wrote books. I just started writing. So, I didn't have any fear, right? Because I didn't know any better. Yeah. And then you just kind of get in the habit of doing it that way. You're like, well, all right, it works. So let's just kind of keep going. And I have a system where I kind of, outline as I go. As I'm writing a book, I'll keep some note cards and, kind of, because there's some math when writing even writing a novel, kind of. So I build the outline out as I go, so that way when I'm done, when I have to revise the book, I have an outline that I've built, so I can kind of start moving pieces around. But that initial draft, it's just me kind of shotgunning words onto the page and hoping it makes sense by the time I'm done.
It occurs to me that we haven't really. Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the cult and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the book. It begins, if I'm not mistaken, 10 years after the dissolution of the cult.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about just the basic setup of the novel?
Yeah, there actually is a plot and not just a cult how-to book. So it takes place 10 years after the kind of fiery demise of the original version of the cult, which is called the Ark of Lazarus. And it involves a surviving cult member. She was a young girl at the time, or teenage-ish girl at the time. She's since changed her name and identity and tried to kind of move on with her life, and also with a young daughter. They're actually the only two survivors of this this cult. Well, when the cult actually kind of went up in flames, they're two of the last survivors. And the start of the book is our main character, Sibylla or Billy. She's living kind of a nondescript life in Colorado. Again, she's had multiple identities because this cult was somewhat infamous. And she's just trying to kind of get on with her life while still dealing with the trauma and the stress and the beliefs that she was grown up with. She spends a lot of time still watching for all the signs that she kind of, was raised with. And if you look hard enough, you can almost always find them. But, her family's attacked, her husband is killed. This all happens in the very early part of the book. And her daughter is taken. And the main thrust of the book is Billy's attempt to recover her daughter, who appears to have been taken by kind of a reinvigorated version of the Ark of Lazarus. Some believers who've connected on the internet and have decided that her daughter holds the key to the future of the cult and maybe the world. So that's kind of the actual crime novel, the police procedural, as Billy strikes out to recover her daughter. She's basically running from a crime because her husband's dead and everyone thinks she's done it. And then it's the rest of the book is kind of this chase scene as she's chasing her daughter and cops and agents are chasing her.
And then we have to go back down to New Mexico where it all started.
Yeah, it's all dovetailing toward the ruins of the compound where Billy and her daughter were at one point.
Right, and then I mean, of course, the really scary part that is what you're talking about, this new Lazarus cult, and you're able to comment on cults, how they operate today in this sort of, I hate to say it, but like post-truth
Right.
internet era, which, all kinds of batshit crazy stuff out there online. And there's a very fertile ground for reinvigorated cults.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, she's up against a lot of people who kind of taken the original ideas of the cult and run with it dramatically. And then it's all takes place against a backdrop of some kind of dramatic events. Birds are falling from the sky.
Right.
There's massive wildfires out west. Two massive storms are coming down onto the East Coast, hurricanes. So if you're the sort of person, planes are disappearing and other
Yeah.
things, if you're the sort of person who believes that the end of the world is coming, there are plenty of signs right at the time the book is taking place, which would indicate that maybe it is.
Right. Now, before I go into some questions here from the audience, I just wanted to double back a little bit and ask you, Philip, about just a little bit more about Henry, because he's such an interesting character. And, he has this this accident that we learn about at the very beginning of the book. And I'm trying to be careful not to do spoilers, but he wakes up from a coma to find that he has lots of new skills, which can be in some ways a blessing and a curse, depending upon how you look at it. Can you talk a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think right. So he goes through a very traumatic event, the poor kid. And I think what I wanted to get across in that opening section was I really wanted the reader to feel the confusion that Henry was feeling when it came to like, well, wait a minute, what's happening? Like, what's happening? Not just like, oh, cool, I can do this now. It's like, it's very traumatic for him. It's not, it's not a happy thing. It's not a gift, and it's not cool. So I think I really wanted to get across that the pain of what he was going through, the feeling of loss, and then also this new dynamic, which was creating so much confusion for him and so much additional trauma for him to process. And I think I actually say in the book, and this is kind of a point I like to make, is, kids are so resilient, and kids are so fascinatingly malleable, you know what I mean, that they when stuff happens to kids, they respond to it in such a different way than an adult would, because we're also hard and calloused, and we have these shells and everything. And when something weird happens, we're just like, no, like, I'm not dealing with that. Whereas the kid's like, oh, this is interesting. Like, what now? How do I respond to this, and how do I move on with this new element of my life? And so I think Henry's dealing a lot with how to move on. And I also think with Henry, it's not just the trauma, it's not just the loss, it's not just the physical trauma, it's not just this new element of his mind that he's dealing with, but he's also is a kid that has a lot of very real, very normal, everyday kid issues. He tries to make friends, and he's trouble making friends. He's not good at video games, he's not good at sports. He likes to read, he's very smart. So he's not a big kid, he's not athletic. So there's all these like things that he's dealing with, and it's a lot for him. And what I love about Henry, and what I love about writing kids, frankly, is because I think a lot of times when you write a kid as a character, they're very 2D. They're very like, this is how I perceive a child to be. And for me, I approach it in a way that I really feel like I have so much respect for kids. I raised a kid, so maybe I'm biased or whatever, but I have so much respect for kids in the sense that they're resilient. They're so smart. They're sponges when it comes to information. They're tough. They're tougher than you think they are, and they're brave. But they're also there's this weird amalgam of like bravery and terror. But like, and I use this analogy sometimes, which is like how a 50-year-old responds to the closet door is slowly opening and a gray hand reaching around into view is very different than the way a 9-year-old would respond to that. And I think the 9-year-old is much more accepting that what's happening is real. It's a situation that needs to be dealt with, and they're going to deal with it. Whereas I think an adult that sort of like maybe rejects it out of hand and just pretends it didn't happen. So Henry is sort of was for me was a way to workshop a lot of those very raw and innocent emotions and that malleability of dealing with trauma and forcing yourself to move on. And then later in the story, when he's dealing with the kidnappers, he shows, you know, incredible bravery. He shows that he's made of tougher stuff than he realized, sometimes to his detriment, in a way, because sometimes he's too brave and it gets him in trouble. But so that was sort of a lot of fun to really dive into Henry and create this really, you know, fleshed out character both internally and externally. And
yeah, and I think sorry, but I think when you write, you know, crime novels particularly, you tend to write a lot of damaged, jaded characters, right? And kids are far from jaded,
right.
and so it's a chance to write, you know, kind of a Pandora's box, right? With a kid, you're going to open and you're going to release a whole bunch of stuff, right? And I think that's the fascinating part of writing younger characters. That, you know, that they're, even when they're hurt, they're not necessarily always damaged the way some of our adult characters in books are, right? Or at least there's still the chance that they're going to overcome their damage, and they're definitely not jaded and cynical. And nowadays, crime novel, I mean, I think that's almost the default mode for most crime novels is jaded and cynical. And so, you know, Henry is a character in a crime novel. It's got horror, but it's got crime in it. And he's not jaded and cynical. And I think that's why he's an attractive character to write, an attractive character to read.
Yeah, even after everything that happens to him,
right.
he's still swinging. And I think that's what made him. I mean, yeah, I loved that character. I really want to explore him again. I want to do kind of a follow-up book at some point where it's sort of 20 years later.
20 years later, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to have him as an adult. And I have some ideas for that, but that's a down the road thing. But it would be a lot of fun to go back to his world and play in that sandbox a little bit more for sure.
I like the whole, just the general riff that, you know, the answers are within rather than maybe without, you know, he needs to go inward to find them.
Yeah.
Let's see, before we wrap up, there's some questions here. Let's see here. Thanks everybody for watching too. Boy, you both have some real fans on here. A lot of people just saying how much they love your stuff. Child Alone is awesome. The Fracassi train is certainly full steam ahead. Indeed. Let's see. Jeff says, I'd love a prequel with Liam.
Oh yeah, so Liam is one of the characters in A Child Alone with Strangers. He's one of the bad guys. There's a little bit of a prequel in the book where you get to know how he got to where he is when you first meet him. Yeah, I don't know. Prequel would be interesting. I do want to do a prequel of well, if I were to write a sequel with Henry later, I would like to get more into the creature's background and where she came from and that whole world. I have some ideas there too, but Liam, I think, is wrapped.
Now, was Jim Cady, was that a slight nod to Cape Fear, John D. McDonald's character?
No.
Wasn't it Jim Cady?
Was it Jim? I have no idea.
Was it Max Cady?
Oh, was it Max? Yeah, you're right. Excuse me, Max Cady. So sorry.
No, coincidence that Cady sounds like a cool villain name, I guess.
Great.
No, originally, and Todd will appreciate this. No, originally, he was Jim Barron, and it was an homage to my friend Laird Barron. But then I realized that it might be too on the nose, because people know that Laird and I are friends, and I was like, maybe it'd be too distracting, so I changed it to Cady.
Let's see. Emily Ann says, I wonder if a collaboration between Phillip and Todd is out of the question. I think the outcome would be awesome. That would be interesting.
Yeah, we could be, was it Straub and King, right? You know?
Yeah.
So he would come with this tremendous outline, and I would come with a bunch of random pages. We'd somehow try to make that work. You know, I think the thing that I hope that Philip and I can talk about is doing a screenplay or something like that, because, I think we both have an interest in that realm. We both had, worked in that area a little bit. And so, developing pitches in a TV series or a screenplay, stuff like that. That's the exact sort of thing that, guys like us would love to sit around over a hazy IPA or a bourbon and debate and discuss, right?
Yeah, I can just say right now publicly, I'm totally on board with that idea. That'd be so much fun. I mean, what's funny about Todd is that sometimes when I'm messaging or emailing him, I'm feeling bad because I'm like, this guy's like actually trying to like make the world a better place right now by stopping criminals and things like that. And I'm like asking him questions about my Nick horror book or whatever. I feel kind of silly, but yeah, maybe after he's retired from saving the world, I would love to do a collaboration. That screenplay would be a lot of fun. I think we could. Yeah, I'm on board.
That's cool. There's a good question here from Mitch. I should have asked this too. How did you, Philip, come up with Henry's ability to see colors and not just read minds? Let's see. And how did you decide which colors represented what emotions or feelings? I loved this take on telepathy.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The colors thing was sort of something that just came to me when I was writing. So that was pretty spontaneous. It is a thing. It is a thing. And I did research it a little bit. I think I wanted him, I think with Henry, I didn't want his abilities to be, for lack of a better word, I didn't want them to be cliche. I didn't want them to be well tread. I wanted them to be something new. And I think the colors were a way for me to sort of like express to the reader how Henry is experiencing thoughts and emotions. It's not just like he's not just reading minds. He's not just knowing the future. He's not. It's not just that black and white. And I have some interesting scenes with Henry and like a child psychologist where he's being forced to kind of guess these Zener cards and things like that. And one of the points I make during those scenes, and this is not a spoiler, I don't think, is that it's not so much Henry's ability to see what can't be seen. It's Henry's ability to see through the eyes of somebody else. And so that was kind of a play on what Henry's abilities really are. And the colors thing was just sort of a way for me to kind of like creatively express how because he doesn't just read thoughts, he reads emotions, right? Too. So it's like he sees bright reds and dark purples, and and it's like hate and his rage and all these kind of things. So I think the colors, as far as choices was concerned, was pretty much just like, I think it was pretty obvious as far as like using the palette, of what you would think of like a brown or a purple or a red or a yellow or a blue would the way it makes you feel is pretty much kind of how I played it across the board. I think, they weren't too specific as to, they were more just kind of like how you would generally accept red is angry, blue is peaceful, green is peaceful, that kind of thing. But I did like playing with that a lot. And that was to Todd's graphic, the idea behind the cover, which I gave to Skyhorse, which was like, I had this idea of like Henry being this like,
I just really,
this sort of like this bright colored child. And that was what the designer came up with. Yeah, which I love.
He's kind of like a prism in many ways, right? The emotions of others flow through him, and they kind of broke out into their respective senses or feelings.
Yeah, and it gets him in trouble because he opens his mouth a couple times and talks about what he's feeling from other people, and people don't like to be read that way, right? So yeah, there's some interesting things I could play with in the book to that kind of accelerated or escalated, maybe a better word to use, sort of the responses to his captors, to him, both good and bad.
Right. Let's see here. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up. It looks like let me see if I have any more questions here. Yeah, Jason says the colors spoke directly to me because my son described numbers as colors when he was young. It was wild.
Yep.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, synesthesia. There's a lot to that. We had a discussion with the big best-selling writer David Baldacci.
Sure.
One of his characters has synesthesia, and we got into a pretty interesting discussion about that. And I started asking about time-related synesthesia, where people view time in a certain way. And it's pretty interesting to think about. I have this view of time going back. It's so bizarre. I don't know if I want to even bring it up because you guys are going to think I'm insane.
Or we're gonna put you in a book.
Or we're going to.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
No, but
Go,
time for
please.
me
I was
has
like,
this-
please go on. I'm making notes.
It's like this weird tube when I think about it going, and it goes back in time in my mind, and it curves at certain points. It's very odd, and I've always been that way. And Baldacci was talking about how, yeah, some people actually look at this grid surrounding them of time, and time passing.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Which of his books did he have the reference to that in? Do you remember? Was it a recent title?
Shoot.
I know he writes a lot of books, so it's hard to.
It's one of his protagonists. It's not a particular book, and I think it might be the Memory Man.
Oh yeah. I know that
That's
series.
the character that has the synesthesia.
I haven't read it yet, but I think I downloaded it when I was doing research. I think it came up in my research. Patrick, you would love my book Observe, which is all about time travel, and it's a thriller, time travel thriller, but it's very much based in hard science. And I actually had the opportunity. One of the cool things about doing what we do is I get to speak to people who are experts in certain areas. And when I was writing Child Alone with Strangers, I got to speak often with a CIA agent who gave me a lot of insights into how things would work in the 90s, which when the book takes place, given what Henry was dealing with and the response teams and all that kind of stuff. So that was really fun. But when I was writing Observe, I got to speak to a NASA scientist, physicist, who specifically deals in physics and time physics, and also he's the guy who did so whenever you see a movie and you see a spaceship traveling through space and like the solar sails open, right? And then, like that's how the ship is like juiced or whatever. He's like the guy. He's like the sales guy. He's been in like documentaries and books and stuff like that. So he's like the guy who did the sales. So I got to speak to him for a while about Observe, which was really fascinating. And I also got to I went online to an event just like we're doing now, and Michio Kaku was doing a Q&A, and I got to ask him a question that is kind of like the key plot point to my novel. And I said, hey, would this work? Because I based a lot of my information on Kip Thorne and Michio Kaku as far as what I've read as a layman. But I got to ask him, like, if this happened and this happened and this happened, would it actually work? And he responded live that it would. So
wow.
It was a wonderful moment for me. I was
Cool.
very validating. But yeah, it's it's so fun to talk to people who are, I mean, Todd is a professional, and when what he does, and it's so neat to be able to talk to people who do some of the stuff for a living and work it into your fiction. That's one of my favorite things about doing. I don't have the resources somebody like Stephen King has, where he like can go, spend a week with, whoever he wants to spend a week with and learn stuff, or have researchers and stuff like that. But I do enjoy learning about different things like the Civil War, or about time travel, or about physics, or about crime, and how police procedurals work and stuff like that. It's such a cool part of what we do.
Yes,
Definitely. So you Philip, you just mentioned you have like four books either in the can or in the works, right? Something like that.
I think it's
what's
4.
coming out next.
So in February, Gothic is coming out from
Right.
Cemetery Dance. In July,
That right here. There's
Yep.
the ARC.
thank you. That's it. Yeah, it'll be hardcover, paperback, and ebook and audiobook. And then July, Boys in the Valley.
Right.
And then in October, I have a new story collection coming out called No One Is Safe. And then in June of 2024, I have a new novel coming out called Brothers, which I have not written yet, but I've sold to Tor and Orbit. So worldwide release in 2024 for that.
Wow. Now, Todd, what about you? What are you working on next?
Well, I have my next book set up. It's called Call the Dark. It comes out about the same time that the Flock did next year. It's my
September.
2023. Yeah, it's 2023 book. It's kind of touches on some of the same thematics that the Flock did, but kind of a much more straightforward, propulsive narrative, not all that epistolary stuff, but I had still some gas in the tank in that area, so I want to kind of finish that book. So publisher's happy with that. Just finished the last couple tweaks, and so it'll be out next year. And I have started the book after that, which I think might be another trilogy. I don't know that I can give many secrets about that. I haven't shown much of it off to my publisher yet, but I'm probably I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 words down the rabbit hole with that. And I think it's going to be a trilogy. I'm introducing some characters that I like very much. And we'll see how that goes. So
Is Call of the Dark another horror crime hybrid?
It pulls back a little of the horror, and it probably treads more into straight thriller territory.
Is it set in the West?
No, actually, Call the Dark is set in West Virginia. And it's first book I've set there. It takes place predominantly during a snow. It's one of these books, again, time compressed. You got a lot of bad people chasing each other over a mountain in a snowstorm. And
Nice.
So, yeah, in the wilds of West Virginia. So it was fun to write. Sort of book I'd probably like to flip into a screenplay at some point. I think it's got that. But excited by it. My editors loved it, for whatever that's worth. They loved it, so we'll see what happens when it comes out.
You think you'll go out on the road at all?
I hope so. I mean, I definitely, I wasn't really available to do that this year with everything else I had going on.
Right.
But I think publishers are more eager to get us out and about now. I'm eager to travel, and I'm long overdue for a visit out west. There's no doubt about that. So
be great to see you again. Well, gentlemen, this has been a great hour. Thanks so much, and congratulations on both of your new books. There we go.
Yep, I got them. Yeah, thank you.
Man, I don't have any props at all, you guys. I just have.
You have that cool skull on the wall there. Which
Yeah.
It looks very writerly. No, it was great, Patrick, for you having us. Philip, it was great to talk to you in person, and it's always a pleasure. So thanks for having us.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And I can't wait to do an event at Poison Pen next year. It's gonna be would love that.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. And I'll definitely come out.
Guys.
Yeah, definitely come
There you
out
go.
for that. Take care.
I'm gonna be there.
Happy holidays. All right.
All right.
Thanks
Bye.
everybody for tuning in.
Bye. Thanks.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.